In this video, I'm going to be showing you a strength build that lets you use every single strength weapon in the game, so whether you want to be an absolute Chad with things like the Giant Crusher or the Greatsword, or prefer using things like the Mario's Executioner to one-shot everything, this build caters to both of those playstyles as well as everything in between, whilst still allowing you to do thousands and thousands of damage against every single enemy. So if you're excited for this one, obviously make sure you hit that like button, and if you're new around here and want to stay up to date with all of the insane builds that we go through in Elden Ring, then make sure that you're subscribed. We're aiming for 20,000 subscribers by the end of the month. But now that that's out the way, let's obviously jump into this insane strength build. So yes, as I mentioned in the intro there, this strength build will let you use any of the strength weapons in the game, and I'm just going to throw up a few of them on screen to show you sort of like the top 10 that I was using whilst running this build. But there are of course a whole lot more strength weapons than this, and as you can tell, there is a whole lot of variety, which just adds to the amount of fun that you can have with this build. Also, just for reference, all of the gameplay that you're going to be seeing in the background is from my new game +6 character, but even with that being my excuse for the damage output is still very good, and the beauty of most of these strength weapons is that they can all break enemy stances really quickly. And of course, I will explain the different playstyles because there are a few ways that you can utilize this build. But before we jump into all of the different Ashes of Wars you can use, talismans, and obviously wonder physic combinations, I firstly want to show you the stats for this build. And as per usual, with all of our builds on the channel, it is a level 150 character. So again, this is a character that you can create in your first couple of playthroughs, but as I mentioned, it's still more than viable in the later new game pluses. And as you can see, we've got 50 points into vigor, 10 into mind, 29 endurance, 65 strength, 17 dexterity, 10 intelligence, 25 faith, and 23 arcane. Now of course, with it being a strength build, it's mainly revolving around strength, and the 17 dexterity is pretty much the minimum requirement for 90% of the strength weapons if they do have a dex requirement. And then again, the 23 arcane is purely there so we can utilize the Mario's Executioner sword. And essentially, no matter which weapon you end up using, it is most likely going to fall into one of these two categories, either the Unga Bunga category, as I like to call it, which is essentially the playstyle for weapons that have a high poise damage output and rely on their charged attacks to obviously do their mass amounts of damage, or they fall into the DPS category, again of course utilizing their multiple attacks in very quick succession, and depending on where your weapon falls into one of these two categories obviously dictates how you should set up this build. So from this point onwards, I'm going to split the talismans and the Ashes of War and all of the boosts into these two categories so that I can show you the best setup no matter what weapon you're using. Now first of all, we are going to delve into the Unga Bunga side of things. So like I say, if you're using a colossal weapon or a greatsword, or even things like the iron balls, you're going to want to focus on the stance damage that you do, especially with their charged heavies. And again, there's a plethora of Ashes of Wars that can also help with the poise damage. Of course, again, if you're running a colossal weapon or a greatsword, you can use the infamous Lion's Claw, which not only gives you a whole bunch of invincibility frames, but of course can just do thousands of damage with the attack itself, but typically breaks your enemy's poises between 2 or 3 uses. But then if you're using the Giant Crusher, which naturally comes with the Lion Claw attack with its charged heavy, you can use something like Royal Knight's Resolve to increase your overall damage output by 80%, and of course do thousands of damage along with the already high poise damage. But then if you're using something like the iron balls or fist weapons in general, you can also use the Cragblade Ash of War to again boost your overall damage output by 15% and your stance damage output by 10%. But then whenever you use the Cragblade Ash of War and apply that sort of like rubble around your weapon, it actually turns it into a heavy variant, turning most weapons with this applied into an S scaled strength weapon. That of course is super fun and super versatile because you can use this Ash of War to maybe apply bleed, frost, or even poison onto the weapon to also give it an added effect while still keeping that S-rated scaling and strength, obviously dealing pretty much 1,000 damage every time you hit an enemy with this weapon. These are pretty much like the 3 Ashes of Wars that I was using with any of the regular weapons that I could of course change the Ash of War on, but obviously you don't have to use your standard weapon. You can of course delve into the somber weapons like Ordovus' Greatsword, Zeluria's Tree, Blasphemous Blade, which again can all do a nice amount of stance damage, and essentially they can all work with these following talismans. So first of all, I recommend that you run the Ritual Swords talisman, as that will boost your overall damage output by 10% whenever you're at full HP. But then I also recommend running the Axe talisman, as that again will grant an extra 10% boost to your charged heavy attacks. So just to be clear, this won't work on Ashes of Wars, but then again, for those that are using an Ash of War like Lion's Claw, or again like Ordovus' Greatsword, then I highly recommend running the Shard of Alexander, as that will of course boost the Ash of War damage. And then from here on out, if you are using a somber weapon with a charged skill power, again like Ordovus' Greatsword, then you can of course run things like the Godfrey's Icon, but that can of course be swapped out for something like the Bull Goat talisman or even the Dragon Crest Great Shield to either boost your poise or boost your overall defense. So then that way, if you are trading hits where you're going to be a bit more up close and personal trying to get those charged heavy attacks off, it's not going to be as frustrating and you're not going to take as much damage. And that can obviously help if you're not running such a heavy armor set like you can see me running in the video in the background. But either way, no matter what weapon you're using in this category, for the Wonder Physic, I highly suggest that you run both the Strength Knot tier and the Stone Barb Crack tier to give you a plus 10 in your strength stat, and then of course boost your overall poise damage once again with the Stone Barb Crack tier. And essentially, with a combination of all of these things, you'll very easily be doing thousands of damage per attack, and like I say, breaking your enemy's poise in 2 or 3 uses of a charge attack or the Ash of War. And I must say, the majority of strength weapons are going to fit into this Unga Bunga playstyle, but there are some exceptions, and those exceptions are more than likely going to fit into the DPS side of things. So if you're using things like the Marius Executioner Sword or like a dual wield Gargle Twin Blade kind of build, then this is of course going to be a better setup for that. That is because rather than focusing on poise damage and charged heavy attacks, we are in fact now going to be focusing on the amount of attacks we can do in very quick succession and boosting our damage output with the relevant talismans and boosting items to enhance each and every attack that we do. But of course, just before I show you the talismans, if you are running any of the twin blades like the Gargoyle twin blades, I highly suggest that you do the same like with the Iron Balls and put the Crag Blade Ash of War on them. Again, this will give you a plus 15% boost to your damage output, and again, when you do apply the Ash of War for the first time, you can change the affinity either to a cold, poison or bleed affinity to add that extra element to the weapons. But then when you actually use the Ash of War in game and put the rubble over them, that turns it back to a heavy affinity, giving you that S-rated scaling in strength. So you keep the poison, cold or bleed, whichever one you put on there, but you also get the same bonus damage output as if you had an S scaling in strength. Whether you use the Twin Blade setup or Marius Executioner, you're going to want to run these following talismans. And of course, we're going to start things off with Millicent's Prosthesis, because not only does it give us a plus 5 in dexterity, but it also gives our first boost for successive damage output, and that can also be stacked with the Rotten Wing Insignia to give us our second boost in successive damage output. But then if you're using Marius Executioner Sword, I highly recommend that you run both the Shard of Alexander and of course Godfrey's Icon, as those will boost your damage output with the Ash of War. But if you're using the Gargoyle Twin Blades or any other Twin Blades with the same setup, then I highly recommend that you run both the Ritual Swords Talisman and the Claw Talisman. That's because with the Twin Blades we're going to be utilising the jump attacks, and therefore the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon are not going to have any effect whatsoever with those attacks. But if you're running Marius Executioner, then of course those are going to have a brilliant impact on your damage output. And before I get comments telling me that these are arcane weapons and therefore they should never be included in an ultimate strength build, both of these weapons are primarily strength scaling weapons. Yes, you can delve into arcane to boost the damage output a little bit more, but even if you just delve everything into strength like I have done in this build, you are still going to see the ridiculous damage outputs that you're seeing on screen. Of course, if you wanted to use a completely different build for these weapons, feel free to do so, but they are still more than viable to deal thousands of damage against pretty much every single enemy in the game, even in the later New Game Pluses. And then again, for the Wonder Physic, I highly recommend that once again you run the Strength Knot tier, but then this time run the Thorny Crack tier to give that third boost in successive damage output. And then finally, no matter whether you're using the Unga Bunga side of things or the DPS side of things, where we've got 25 25 points into Faith. We can of course use both Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength to increase our physical damage and just our overall damage outputs by 25% and 20% respectively. And although I haven't featured them necessarily in this video, where we've got the points in Arcane, Faith and Dexterity, we can of course use other weapons like Malekith's Black Blade, again the Blasphemous Blade like I mentioned earlier, and if you want to run Millicent's Prosthesis, that then allows you to use the Godslayer's Greatsword, which again just adds to the multiple weapons you already had access to, meaning that this build is extremely versatile, giving you all sorts of different ways to play the game, have an immense amount of fun, destroy bosses with absolute ease, which is why for me this is the ultimate strength build in Elden Ring. And yeah, there you have it. Like I say, that for me is the ultimate strength build that you can create, and it truly is a whole load of fun, which is why I wanted to bring this video to you guys. Obviously we've got the Elden Ring DLC fast approaching, and I know a lot of you are going to be jumping back into the game relatively soon, so I'm assuming some of you are looking for new ways to play the game, or at least give you all sorts of different options when the DLC arrives, and this is of course a perfect build just for that. But as always, like I say at the end of these videos, I am not the best Elden Ring player, as the gameplay is probably showing, and I know that you guys are a lot better at the game than me, so let me know if you've got any suggestions to make this build even better. I did try delving a bit more into Faith to give you the Howl of Shibiri incantation instead, but I found the endurance was a little bit more helpful to of course mitigate the increased weight gain, especially with the colossal weapons. So yeah, feel free to let me know in the comments if you have any ways to change this build or make it any better, or just simply let me know what you're running at the moment. I'm always intrigued to see how you guys are playing the game and whether or not you're liking these builds. So yeah, as I say, get in the comments, let us know your thoughts and feelings about this video, and like I said at the beginning, if you wouldn't mind leaving a like whilst you're down there, it helps out the channel tremendously, and it lets me know that you're enjoying these videos and you want to see more crazy, versatile, overpowered builds like this. And we're of course closing in on that 20,000 subscriber mark, which is still crazy to say even to this day. So if you want to join the existing legends that have already subscribed to the channel, then make sure you hit that button down below too, and that way we can make history together, and as a thank you I'll be bringing you the best Elden Ring content possible. But other than that, I've said everything that I need to say, so go have an immense amount of fun with this build, and of course let me know how you get on. Of course, thank you for watching this video. You guys are all incredible and your support really is appreciated. But I guess for now, I will catch you in the next video for whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.